September 1940. The basement office at Navy headquarters smelled like coffee and cigarette smoke, and Agnes Meyer Driscoll sat hunched over her desk at 2 in the morning, staring at rows of numbers that looked like complete nonsense to everyone else in the building. She'd been working on this Japanese naval code for 16 hours straight, her eyes burning from the dim light, her back aching from the wooden chair that nobody had bothered to replace in 5 years. But she couldn't stop because somewhere in these encrypted messages was information that could save American lives. The other cryptanalysts had given up days ago, walked out of the office shaking their heads and told their superiors the code was unbreakable, that they tried every standard technique in the book and hit nothing but dead ends. But Agnes saw patterns where others saw chaos, relationships between numbers that appeared random but weren't, subtle repetitions that occurred just often enough to mean something. She grabbed her pencil and started marking symbols, using a technique she'd developed herself over years of trial and error, something the Navy brass had called impractical and actually tried to ban from official use because it didn't fit their idea of how serious cryptanalysis should look. They said her method was too unconventional, too different from the standard mathematical approaches that male cryptanalysts had been using for years, too much like arts and crafts and not enough like real intelligence work. But Agnes Meyer Driscoll didn't become America's top codebreaker by following the rules that other people made, and she definitely didn't get there by caring what Navy commanders thought about her methods. She joined the Navy as a civilian cryptanalyst back in 1918 when most people genuinely believed women couldn't handle the mental demands of breaking enemy codes, when her male colleagues made jokes about letting the school teacher play with numbers, and she'd spent the next 2 decades proving every single one of them wrong in the most spectacular way possible. Her colleagues eventually started calling her Madam X, partly out of respect for her abilities and partly because her methods were so mysterious and effective that even other expert codebreakers couldn't always follow her thinking or replicate her results. She worked alone most of the time, preferred it that way actually, because collaboration meant explaining her process to people who didn't understand it and wasting time defending techniques that she knew worked. And here's the thing, this story gets even more insane as we go deeper. So if you're enjoying this, smash that subscribe button because we tell stories like this every single week and you're not going to believe what happens next. What made Agnes different from every other cryptanalyst in the Navy wasn't just that she was brilliant, though she definitely was, having taught mathematics, music, and physics at a Texas college before the Navy recruited her during World War I when they were desperate for anyone who could handle complex analytical work. It was her completely unique approach to cryptanalysis that set her apart from everyone else in the field and made her simultaneously the most valuable and most controversial codebreaker in American intelligence. While male cryptanalysts relied almost exclusively on mechanical methods and mathematical formulas, working with slide rules and calculating machines and pages of equations, Agnes developed what she called the hairpin method, a technique that used physical tools and visual pattern recognition to crack codes that resisted every traditional analysis method anyone could throw at them. She'd literally use hairpins, the kind women wore in their hair, and colored threads on large sheets of paper to track letter frequencies and identify patterns in encrypted messages, moving the pins around like pieces on a game board until the underlying code structure revealed itself to her in ways that pure mathematics couldn't show. To Agnes, codes weren't just mathematical problems. They were puzzles with physical dimensions, spatial relationships that you could see and manipulate if you approached them the right way. Navy commanders would walk past her desk and see this middle-aged woman with hairpins and threads scattered across papers covered in numbers, and they thought it looked absolutely ridiculous, like some kind of quilting project that had no business being in a military intelligence facility. It didn't look serious or scientific or professional by their standards, and that bothered them immensely because the Navy had an image to maintain. So in 1938, some genius in command actually issued an official memo discouraging cryptanalysts from using unconventional physical methods in favor of standardized mathematical approaches that looked more legitimate and could be easily documented in official reports. The memo didn't name Agnes specifically, but everyone knew exactly who they were talking about because she was the only cryptanalyst in the building using hairpins as intelligence tools. The memo basically said that while creative approaches were appreciated, the Navy needed to maintain professional standards and stick to proven analytical methods that could be taught to new recruits and replicated by different analysts. Agnes read that memo, smiled to herself, and ignored it completely. She knew her hairpin method worked because she'd already used it to break the Japanese Red Book code back in 1926. A complex diplomatic cipher that had stumped Navy intelligence for months despite their best mathematical analysts working on it around the clock. Agnes had cracked it in 3 weeks using nothing but patience, hairpins, colored thread, and her unique ability to see patterns that existed in dimensions other cryptanalysts never even considered looking at. She'd handed her superiors decrypted Japanese diplomatic messages that revealed sensitive negotiations and strategic planning, and the Navy brass had been absolutely thrilled with the intelligence windfall. The Navy gave official credit for that breakthrough to her male supervisor, of course, a man named Lieutenant Commander something or other who'd barely even looked at the code. Because that's exactly how things worked in 1926 when the idea of a woman solving problems that stumped male officers was just too embarrassing for the Navy to acknowledge publicly. But everyone who actually worked in cryptanalysis knew the truth. Knew that Agnes had done it alone while her supervisor took credit in official reports and probably got promoted for her work. She never complained about it publicly, never made a fuss. Because complaining would have meant getting fired, and she loved the work too much to risk that over something as petty as proper credit. By 1940, with war clouds gathering across the Pacific and tensions with Japan reaching a breaking point, Agnes was focused on something much bigger and infinitely more dangerous than diplomatic codes. The Japanese Navy used an incredibly sophisticated cipher system called JN-25, a monster of a code that protected their most sensitive military communications, including fleet movements, battle plans, strategic orders, supply routes, and everything else that mattered for naval operations. Breaking JN-25 wasn't just important for American intelligence, it was absolutely critical, maybe the most important intelligence objective the Navy had. Because without knowing where Japanese ships were going and what they planned to do, the United States would be fighting completely blind when war finally came, and everyone with half a brain knew war was coming soon. The problem was that JN-25 was an absolute beast of a code, easily the most complex cipher system Agnes had ever encountered. It was a 2-part encryption system that first encoded Japanese words and phrases into 5-digit number groups using a codebook with thousands of entries, and then added random number groups called additives to disguise the patterns, making it exponentially harder to crack than anything Agnes had tackled before. It was a brilliant design actually, because even if you figured out the additive system, you still needed to crack the codebook, and even if you cracked some of the codebook, the additives changed regularly, which meant starting over. The Japanese Navy had put serious thought into making JN-25 unbreakable, and they'd done a pretty good job. Most cryptanalysts at Navy headquarters looked at intercepted JN-25 messages and saw an impossible puzzle with too many variables, too many unknowns, and not enough intercepted data to find a mathematical solution. They'd work on it for a few weeks, make no progress, and eventually give up and move on to easier targets. But Agnes looked at the same encrypted messages and started seeing relationships between number groups, subtle patterns that repeated just often enough to give her a fingerhold on the code structure, tiny cracks in the encryption that nobody else noticed. She knew the patterns were there because all codes have patterns, even brilliantly designed ones, because human brains create patterns even when they're trying not to, and if you looked long enough and hard enough, you could find them. Agnes worked obsessively on JN-25 throughout 1940, sometimes sleeping on a cot in her office, eating meals at her desk, filling dozens of notebooks with number sequences and pattern analyses that nobody else in the building could interpret or even understand. Her colleagues thought she was wasting her time, telling her she should focus on codes they could actually break. But Agnes had a stubborn streak a mile wide, and when she committed to something, she saw it through. Her hairpin method evolved specifically for JN-25, becoming more sophisticated and complex as she developed new techniques to track multiple cipher layers simultaneously, creating 3-dimensional pattern maps that looked absolutely insane to anyone walking past her desk but made perfect sense to her. She used different colored threads for different types of number groups, red for what she thought might be verbs, blue for what seemed like ship names, green for locations, creating a visual web of relationships that her mind could process in ways that pure numbers on a page couldn't show her. It was like she was weaving the code structure into something she could see and touch and manipulate, turning abstract mathematical relationships into physical reality. Other cryptanalysts would stop by her desk, look at this elaborate creation of pins and threads and numbers, shake their heads, and walk away thinking she'd finally lost it. But Agnes knew she was getting closer because the patterns were starting to make sense. The relationships were becoming clearer, and she could feel the code structure beginning to reveal itself. Then came the week in December 1940 that changed everything and proved that Agnes's supposedly ridiculous methods were actually far more effective than anything the Navy's standardized approaches had produced. She'd been working on a batch of intercepted messages for 3 days straight, barely sleeping, drinking coffee until her hands shook, when suddenly a section of the code just opened up for her like a door swinging wide. She'd found the key to a portion of the additive system, which meant she could start stripping away that layer of encryption and getting down to the actual codebook numbers underneath. And once she had those, she could start building a partial codebook by comparing messages and finding repeated number groups that had to mean the same thing. Agnes cracked 23 separate Japanese naval messages that week, decrypting them well enough to extract useful intelligence even though she didn't have the complete codebook yet. 23 messages using a method the Navy had literally tried to ban 2 years earlier. The messages revealed ship positions in the Pacific, supply routes between Japanese bases, maintenance schedules for aircraft carriers, and tactical planning discussions that gave American intelligence its first real window into Japanese naval operations in years. It wasn't complete intelligence, there were still gaps and uncertainties, but it was real, actionable information that could help American commanders make strategic decisions. The intelligence community went absolutely crazy when Agnes submitted her decrypts because this wasn't just a breakthrough. It was proof that JN-25 could be broken despite its complexity. And if it could be broken consistently with enough intercepted traffic and enough analysis time, the United States would have an enormous strategic advantage when war came. Naval intelligence officers who'd dismissed Agnes's work as a waste of resources suddenly wanted daily updates on her progress. Admirals who'd never bothered learning her name started asking pointed questions about how quickly she could train other analysts in her methods. But even then, even with this massive intelligence victory, Agnes didn't get the public recognition she deserved or the credit that should have gone to her in official records. Navy reports attributed the JN-25 breakthrough to the cryptanalysis team as a whole without naming her specifically, and male colleagues who'd contributed far less to the effort, who'd maybe checked her math or helped organize intercepted messages, suddenly found themselves receiving official commendations and promotions while Agnes stayed at the same pay grade she'd been at for years. One guy got a Navy Commendation Medal for work on JN-25 when his biggest contribution had been bringing Agnes coffee during her late-night work sessions. The injustice was obvious to everyone who worked in cryptanalysis, but nobody in command seemed to care because giving proper credit to a woman meant admitting she was better than the men, and the Navy wasn't ready for that conversation. Agnes kept working anyway because the mission mattered more than personal credit, and over the next year she trained other cryptanalysts in her methods, sharing techniques she developed over 2 decades, helping build the team that would provide crucial intelligence throughout the Pacific War. She was patient with the trainees, even when they didn't understand her visual approach at first, even when they wanted to stick to traditional mathematical methods because that's what they'd been taught. She'd sit with them for hours, showing them how to see patterns in encrypted text, how to use physical tools to track relationships between code groups, and how to think about ciphers as puzzles with dimensions beyond just numbers on paper. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Agnes was absolutely devastated, not just by the horrific loss of life and the destruction of the Pacific Fleet, but by the crushing knowledge that if the Navy had taken her JN-25 work more seriously earlier, if they'd invested more resources in cryptanalysis instead of treating it like a secondary concern compared to ships and planes, they might have had enough warning to prevent the disaster or at least reduce the damage. She'd been telling her superiors for a year that JN-25 traffic was increasing, that Japanese naval communications suggested major operations planning, but intelligence assessments kept saying Japan wouldn't risk attacking American territory directly. Agnes knew her decrypts were incomplete, that she was missing huge pieces of the puzzle, but the signs were there if anyone had been paying attention. She threw herself into the work with renewed intensity after Pearl Harbor, working 18 and 20-hour days, training new cryptanalysts as fast as the Navy could recruit them, expanding her team because suddenly the brass understood that breaking Japanese codes wasn't just important, it was essential for survival. By early 1942, her team was reading significant portions of Japanese naval communications on a regular basis, tracking fleet movements across the Pacific, identifying ship deployments, reading damage reports after battles, and giving American commanders intelligence advantages they'd never had before. The real impact of Agnes's codebreaking became crystal clear at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, the turning point of the Pacific War where everything changed in one day of desperate fighting. American commanders knew exactly where the Japanese fleet was going, when they'd arrive, what formation they'd use, and what their battle plan looked like because cryptanalysts using Agnes's techniques had decoded their operational orders weeks before the battle. Admiral Nimitz knew the Japanese were targeting Midway Island, knew they were bringing 4 aircraft carriers, knew their planned attack timing, and knew their diversion tactics, all because Agnes Meyer Driscoll had figured out how to break codes with hairpins and colored thread. The United States Navy sank 4 Japanese carriers at Midway, destroying Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific and shifting the entire balance of power in the war. Japan never recovered from those carrier losses, and the rest of the Pacific War was basically the United States pushing them back island by island. That victory happened because a woman using methods the Navy had tried to ban had figured out how to break codes that everyone else said were unbreakable. Thousands of American sailors and pilots survived Midway because of intelligence Agnes provided, but she never got a medal for it, never got her name mentioned in the after-action reports, never received any public acknowledgement at all. Agnes Meyer Driscoll continued working for Navy intelligence throughout World War II and well into the Cold War era, developing new cryptanalysis techniques that remained classified for decades after her retirement. She worked on German codes, Soviet codes, Chinese codes, always staying ahead of the curve, always finding new ways to crack supposedly unbreakable encryption systems. She never received a public medal or a parade, never got her name in the newspapers like the male codebreakers who did similar or lesser work, and many of her most significant contributions were deliberately obscured in official records because the Navy didn't want to admit publicly how much they'd relied on methods they'd once tried to ban and how much of their intelligence success came from one unconventional woman. By the time the war ended in 1945, Agnes had helped break multiple Japanese cipher systems beyond just JN-25, including Japanese army codes and diplomatic codes that provided intelligence for planning the final campaigns of the war. She trained dozens of cryptanalysts who went on to successful careers in military and civilian intelligence agencies, and she developed analytical methods that influenced American cryptology for generations. The National Security Agency, which was created after World War II, used her techniques as foundational training for new cryptanalysts throughout the 1950s and 1960s, though they rarely mentioned her name even in classified materials. Some of her techniques are still classified today, more than 70 years after she developed them, which tells you something about how far ahead of her time she really was and how effective her methods proved to be. The hairpin method itself was finally declassified in the 1990s, but other techniques she developed for attacking complex multilayer encryption systems remain protected because they're apparently still relevant to modern cryptanalysis. Agnes retired from Navy intelligence in 1959 after 41 years of service, most of it spent in basement offices working on problems that officially didn't exist. She died in 1971 at age 79, and even her obituary barely mentioned her cryptanalysis work because most of it was still classified. The few colleagues who could talk about her contributions described her as the finest cryptanalyst America ever produced, someone whose intellectual capabilities and innovative thinking were unmatched in the field. But the general public never knew her name, never learned about her role in winning World War II, never heard about how one woman with hairpins changed history. It wasn't until the late 1990s, when the Navy finally started declassifying World War II intelligence records, that historians began piecing together just how important Agnes Meyer Driscoll had been. They found her name buried in operational reports, discovered her training manuals that had shaped a generation of cryptanalysts, read her technical papers that had pushed the entire field forward. They realized that many breakthroughs officially credited to men or to anonymous teams had actually been her work, stolen or obscured because giving her proper credit would have challenged too many assumptions about women's capabilities. Thanks for watching this story about the woman who broke Japanese codes with hairpins and helped win the Pacific War. Hit that subscribe button because next week we're covering the German U-boat commander who realized too late that the Allies were reading his messages. And trust me, you definitely don't want to miss that one.